Hi, everybody. Welcome. I'm Barry Kostrinsky, president of ATOA. ATOA is the Artist Talk on Art, or Artist Talk on Art. We're a 501c3. We've been around since 1975. All our talks have been live in the Lower West Side of New York City. However, as a result of Zoom, we have been meeting, as a result of COVID, we have been meeting via Zoom virtually. And this is now our 79th Monday that we've met. They're not quite consecutive. We took one or two holidays, but that's really about it. Hopefully we'll be going back in January to the First Presbyterian Church at 12 West 12th Street, again in the Lower West Side of New York City. If you want to know anything about ATOA, our website is atoanyc.org. This talk is being captured and will go to our YouTube channel. The link for our YouTube channel is on our website. And as well, under calendar, you can see talks that are coming up. And I will highlight, we have a talk coming up next week, which is one of those open discussions where we invite artists to share for 5 or 10 minutes. If anybody here is interested, reach out to me and I'll put you on the list. You can do it last minute, but it always enters the possibility that we do get filled up with presenters. We do have something new on our website. We have Art for Sale, which is curated exhibitions by a board member. The premiere show is curated by Geraldine Hanrahan. And if you go into Art for Sale, you can see what we have up. The art is for sale. It benefits the artist. We give them 70%, and ATOA keeps 30%. I guess the takeaway is look at our website. There's lots of information there, including our past talks. And if you'd like to become a part of an ATOA talk in 2022, there's information there as well. Programming committee meets monthly. You're all welcome to come. Look on the website. There's information. You can email me. Jacqueline Sarah Rada is the secretary for ATOA, and her information is there as well. So I welcome you all. So nice to see so many regulars, and thank you all for coming tonight. I think we've got a great talk. We've shown a real diversity of artists presenting, painters, sculptors, performance artists. We've really shown a lot, but we haven't touched on architecture that much, if at all. And tonight's talk, Informed by Architecture, was put together. It's going to be moderated by, and it was organized by, Steven Talasnik, and as well, Yuri Masnyj will be presenting as well. I think we're in for an exciting showing tonight. Hopefully you've all seen our email blast. And by the way, if you're not on our email list, you can throw it in the chat, or again, go to the website. There are ways to get on it, or you can always email me and I'll add you. So without further ado, or with too much ado already, I want to welcome you, Steven. I want to thank you for organizing this, for bringing another slice of a very large pie of art that you bring a very interesting dimension to. I think we're all going to find it exceptionally interesting. And thank you, Steven, and welcome.
Thank you, Barry. I'm not exactly sure how you got to me, but I think it may well be through Instagram. But when offered the opportunity to present something like this, since the work that I do over the past 30 years has been informed by architecture, and was asked to include someone else, it was for me a natural choice to go to Yuri, who will be speaking after me. We've known each other for a couple of years, and I think that it's important to upfront establish, not so much for semantics, but just an understanding as the difference for calling about relating to informed as opposed to anything else. And I always rely on a great and contentious interview done with Frank Lloyd Wright back in the early 60s or late 50s, when he was talking about his work. And the interviewer said to him, I think what separates your work is that your work is inspired by nature. And Frank Lloyd Wright had this typical sort of shit fit, if I may use that word. We're in mixed company. And he said, no, inspiration is cheap impersonation. What I do is I'm informed by nature. I'm not inspired by nature. And the difference is that to be informed is to take nature and to drag it through your own personal encyclopedia of experience. And in doing so, dragging out a new type of nature, which is probably more honest and more natural than nature itself. So whether or not you agree with the statement, it's kind of high-end bravura. The idea is that inspiration, even picked up by someone like Chuck Close, I think, who said something like inspiration was for lazy people. What it's about is going to the studio and working. So I thought that the perfect situation in both of our cases, and I cannot speak for Yuri, but I can say on my behalf, is that to be informed by architecture is more important than to be inspired by architecture. So if we go to the first slide, Yuri.
1 second, hold on.
Okay. I'm starting out with these two, if you're doing that. And I always, most of my speaking situations is within the realm of architecture and engineering. But I always like to start with this juxtaposition of Michelangelo drawing and the sculpture, the slaves. Because there is a sense of the unfinished, but complete. And I think that one of the things that distinguishes architecture, for instance, from sculpture, is that in the case of most sculpture, it can exist in an unfinished state, but architecture has to be finished in order to be complete. I think that we're seeing, in the realm of architecture, we're seeing more and more examples of architecture that appears to be unfinished. But there is something inherently infinite about the notion of the figure drawing and the sculpture, the figure that is making its way out of the boulder. These are elements that I've always found important because they've informed my work, even though they are not architectural. But that I rely, and whenever I need to recharge the battery, I go back to looking at the figure, the human form, because within it, I am able to find everything that I can find in architecture, with the possible exception of most of the drawings, most of the sculptures that I look at in figure are not finished. And in that sense, there was the belief that in the unfinished state, you were able to incorporate the role of the viewer as a participant in the act of creation. If we go to the next one, this is a better example of, I'm going to move Meyer. I don't know if it's in the way, but this is the type of work that I do, and I'm going to show a series of about 12 to 14 pairs of more recent works. And it is important to understand in my work that there is no measurement. Everything is done intuitively, and everything, for the most part, is finding form as a result of building improvisationally. And if it is one thing beyond architecture that influences the work that I do, it would be music, and certain types of music, in particular jazz and improvisational jazz, some aspects of classical music. But I see a real strong kinship, for me at least, between the types of building that I do and the types of music that I feel inform the work that I do. But paramount among all of this is that there is a strong relationship between the architecture or the sculpture and drawing itself. That line is the basis of all of the architectural work that I do. I have no formal training in architecture or engineering, for that matter, nor sculpture, so that everything that I build is really out of impulse. And it's about, again, this term of finding form is also closely aligned with terminology that I love to rely on, which is fictional engineering. So that could these buildings, if they existed, stand? They probably could. But the idea is that they are completely reliant on variable repetition and space frames. And if you're not familiar with the notion of space frames, you'll be able to see it as the work evolves. We can go to the next one, but first let me give you a sense of scale. That the twin piece that you saw before was about 36 inches tall. They're all handmade, and that's very important for me, is that everything has the hand in it, because the hand then connects the making of the piece to the act of drawing. They could easily be manufactured or fabricated, but it's important for me to give whatever I do in the way of engineering a sense of humanism. And humanism for me is something that is extracted from the act of drawing. So that what I love is the juxtaposition of drawing to sculpture. And in this particular case, drawing to engineering. This is the same piece, and it is completely has evolved out of the multitude of space frames. And for those of us that are not familiar with the term, we're talking about generally triangulation, linear, flat frame, of which these frames are assembled together to create a form. And in the case of the work that I do, I have no clear sense as to what these are going to look like. There is no end game. There is no predetermination. There is no drawing that anticipates where these are going. So in that sense, these pieces are improvised, but they are all reliant on space frames. And I use the construction of a Zeppelin, if you're familiar with the skeletal parts of a Zeppelin, that is the classic example of how I learned how to build. And when I wanted to learn how to build big, instead of trying to imitate that which was large, I decided to enlist the notion of connecting space frames, which were actually small and flat and grids, so that there is a greater reliance on the assembly of variable grids in order to build large. But again, I think the important aspect, if you're to connect all of this work, is that there's a strong connection between the hand, the drawing, and the assembly process. Next.
Steven, let me ask you a question. You're getting great responses, as I thought you would. Babs Reingold says, these are beautiful, Steven. Let's see. Larry asks, Steven, when do you know you have finished?
Well, going back to that very first slide of the figure and the figure coming out of stone, there is no sense of knowing when there is a point called finished. It is when it's complete. That's when it's finished. So I never think of it as a beginning, a middle, and an end being finished. I think of it that the process leads one to a sense of completeness. And how do you determine completeness? Completeness can be arbitrary. But when you get to a point when you live with the work in the studio and you feel that nothing can be added or taken away, then that's when you technically can call it finished. But I never call it finished. I just call it is part of the process of an infinite solution. So
Very nice.
I really
also they are asking, what materials are you using here?
In most of the cases, I'm using wood. And I like to work with wood because for me, it is, for someone who has no formal training in sculpture, wood is a very basic material. It is the only sculptural material that I tend to work with. It's a natural material. And in most cases, it is encapsulated in different types of acrylic resins or paint or various solutions. But keep in mind that when I did my first piece of sculpture when I was about 6 years old out of wood. And then there was a near 40-year gap. I did my second piece of sculpture when I was about 35 or 40 years old. So I really relied on wood because it was a simple material to work with. And because of the simple way in which you can manipulate it, it harkened back to the act of drawing, so that everything emanates from the act of drawing. Next. Diverging out from those types of pieces that are reliant on space framing, going back to drawing, these are two different examples of how the figure resurfaces in the works themselves. Both of these are about the same height, about 4.5, 5 feet tall. The piece on the right is one continuous piece of flat reed that has been woven into itself to create what ultimately appears to be the unfinished figure. And the piece on the left is the first skinned piece, because remember, for the most part, these are pieces that do not have skins. They are skeletally naked. And I prefer the nakedness of sculpture than I do the the nakedness of architecture versus the skin of architecture. There's a a brilliant line that that I didn't come up with, but it was a part of a critique of the Frank Gehry piece on the West Side Highway. And the first line of the review was, "I saw Frank Gehry naked and I liked it." And it's the whole idea that sometimes architecture is its most brilliant and breathes its breath when it is naked, when it is pure line. But is it functional? Probably not, because it has a certain purpose in mind. But the piece on the left is the first time when I attempted to combine these skeletons, these frames, and an artificial skin. Next. This is a piece from Storm King that I did. This was the first large-scale piece of public art that I did. And again, the piece on the right is a continuous assembly of space frames that were done without measurement. These are bamboo skewers and zip ties on the right-hand side. It's about 20 inches tall. And again, no measurement, no predetermination to how large or what the shape of the piece would be. It was a matter of making, in this particular case, about 40 space frames and assembling them into a shape. What shape it was going to be, how it was going to be determined in terms, as finished, I had no idea. But it evolved into the piece on the left, which was 115 feet of running wall and 25 feet tall and about 15 feet deep. And that was bamboo poles and stainless steel zip ties. That was on the side of a mountain leading up to the Noguchi sculpture, if you're familiar with the land out at Storm King. But the other thing that was important was, how do you make something large and make it intimate? How do you make something large and make it very fragile looking? And the piece on the left was the first piece in which I worked with actual engineers and had to do that in order to make sure that the piece would withstand the elements. And it did for a period of 2 years before it came down. Next. And in the case of another large piece in Montana, the piece on the left is probably the closest to a genuine architectural structure that I've made. It was based on the model on the right-hand side, which was originally designed to float in the East River as part of 9 different floating structures that were commissioned by the Buckminster Fuller Institute for using the East River as a means to sustain life and create habitats. And the entire project was actually killed by the Army Corps of Engineers after Sandy. If you remember the waterfalls, there was a dictate that there was to be no art on the East River, so that those pieces eventually were to make themselves available to the land and went out west. And this is one of those pieces, and it measures 35 feet tall, 55 feet across. It's made with solid cedar oak logs. Next. The next 3 pieces that you're going to see are assembles or fragments of unearthed architecture or engineering. In this particular case, this is part of a 100-piece installation. These are small handheld objects that are based on the deconstruction or the destruction, actually, of a large boat. It's based on the story, if you're familiar with the movie Fitzcarraldo and Werner Herzog's movie. This is in preparation for an installation that is upcoming, where I'm showing 100 artifacts drained or pulled out of the sandbogs on either side of the Amazon, which refer to this boat that was completely destroyed. Every part of this, though, however, is part of a fragment of an earlier sculpture, so that many of the sculptures that I build do not end up in a final state, but end up in a situation where I cut them apart and create something new from them. In comparison, the next grid are fossils, and these fossils are also fragments of former sculptures. They are all handheld. The maximum size is about 10 by 10 by 3 or 4. And the difference in this one is that there are about 100 pieces, and they were buried in different parts of the country where I was working. And they were buried there so that the original material, which in some cases was wood, would absorb the natural iron or elements, minerals from the earth and change color as a result of being buried in the ground. And then they were unearthed after a year, and this is what you were left with. So that this is the nucleus of a new installation that would feature, again, about 100 artifacts that were actually part of larger sculptures that I did. And last, in that last group, and these were actually parts of fragments of models for a piece that I did at the Denver Botanic Gardens. They were all structures that were floating. They appear to be highly geometric, but they are all, again, fictional engineering is employed. There is no sense of mathematics. They are all variable repetition. And each one of them is based on essentially a type of plankton or seed structure that was available at the Botanic Gardens that I was informed by, not influenced by. And these were all small scale, again, about 12 to 14 inches across, handheld, and assembled. Eventually dipped in a graphite solution to freeze them over a period of time. And so there's 3 different variations of fragmentations or artifacts that were extracted from originally other sources, usually sculptures that existed prior. Next.
I do want to read a couple of comments. Babs Reingold says, fascinating process to make these artifacts. Jenna Lash asks, and as well Bab asks, can you talk a little bit more about your graphite solution? But I do want to read a few other thoughts. Jenna Lash says, have you had certain mentors, or are you self-taught in every way? Alyssa Pritzka says, exciting art. Fran Beeler, these are wonderful, a kind of living architecture. And as well, I would add, you sort of let them die a little. When you bury these pieces, you sort of let them devolve into a different form. So if you don't mind, are you hearkening back? Are you influenced by others? Or you really, I would say you're riding your own tricycle here.
Well, truth be told, I have a background in fine arts, but I am not a card-carrying member of a community of painters and sculptors where I am much more closely aligned with a community of engineering and architecture. But at the end of the day, they read as sculpture. I tend to be influenced by object makers, and not, when it comes to drawing, there's very little in the way of contemporary drawing that I'm looking at as a reference point. The drawing that I do was taught as a result of copying architectural drawing. And I mentioned early on Frank Lloyd Wright. He would be one of the masters of drawing that I would copy as a child. But people like that were sort of the mentors. And I was always attracted to architecture, the building of scale models, the building of actual structures, the infrastructure, the skeletons of structures, and less so of traditional sculpture. But when there was an appeal to look at that work, it was really very much figurative and based on the figure. So that there was a apparent contradiction in that I was informed by figurative art, but the end product became much more closely aligned with engineering and architecture. And of those 2 disciplines, I'm going to say that engineering really overtook architecture as the true fascination, because engineering was exposed to construction, and it was also the closest for me. You referenced the graphite covered pieces. Those are intended to have the quality of a drawing. And so every structure that I do, including this one that's on the screen now, has a connection to the act of drawing. And the piece that you see on the slide right now is the next phase, the most recent phases, which is to combine a very fluid linear gestural line with the rectilinear space frame. but also to add the performative to these activities, so that what you don't see is that this is actually a set for dancers. And the idea is to take sculpture and engineering and architecture and join it to performance activity in music, so that this structure here, again, no preset plan as to how this is going to happen. It evolves, it has an infinite quality to it, it is linear. So it is just like a drawing, almost like a Giacometti drawing on some level. It is combined with the rectilinear understanding of an Eiffel infrastructure in a bridge. The lighting is also a new component, and the lighting for me is something that came out of a real passion for the drawings of Seurat, but also theatrical lighting. And so lighting is another component that is used in a drawing. And so I wanted to include it. It also interacts with those that are dancing or performing inside these structures. So this piece is large enough for people to get inside of. Again, I think I mentioned it's about 25 feet tall. Next. And drawing remains at the core of everything that I do. These, I just have a couple samples of drawings that were done during the pandemic, and they are based on flotation and airships and zeppelins, and more importantly, floating cities. And the idea was that as a resident that was sort of kept at home, that I wanted to do drawings that were based on isolation and disconnect from the community or a community. So I did a series of these drawings where people would live and not have a sense of actual place. So again, these are pencil drawings. They are about 36 long and about 12 inches high. Next. And these drawings, which were done simultaneously, are aerial views of, or maps of isolated pockets within the city. So that if one had the luxury of getting closer to any of these, you would see that these are little cells, little circular cells, little communities that were all fixed. And it's as if you were floating over the city and seeing these little parts of how people lived in isolation, separate from each other. Next. This was a piece that I did, which was a collapsible or a folding house that was made of the same materials, the basswood rectilinear structures, and then the flat reed, which was woven into these rectilinear structures. And this was an actual performance set that was used for dancers and lighting designers. And the entire structure could fold into itself like a spiral. It was when stretched out, it was the full size of the gallery, which was approximately 35 feet long and about 10 feet tall. Next. Again, a couple of more drawings of these floating cities. I had always been interested in science fiction as a part of the evolution of the work that I do. And Jules Verne, if you talk about an influence, was responsible for the nucleus of drawings similar to this. But they also have to have the hand, if you'll excuse the expression, but the hand of that which is related to old master drawing. There has to be something in it that is timeless, and there has to be something that is not of a specific time, but something that could allude to a past, a present, and a future. But the thing that's consistent in all of them is that you see the hand in all of the drawings. Next. These are, as we are honing in towards the end, a drawing on the left, a hand-drawn without measurements globe, and on the right, a hand-built sphere without measurement. And part of this was just the challenge of trying to imitate the flat globe into a three-dimensional globe. It was a test of sorts, very much influenced by Boulez and people like Piranesi. But the idea of the hand being capable of making mathematical formula, almost like a homemade map. He's about 36 inches across. Next. Similar to the dome, which was, again, a situation where there was no mathematics involved, but proportion. And these were assembled just using basswood sticks I cut with wire cutters, and I glue with traditional glues, and they are glued into themselves, and they are based on simple laws of engineering that is a result of deconstructing Brunelleschi's domes and finding out how domes were created and trying to almost mimic that type of infrastructure. This is about a 36-inch diameter. This is, by the way, one of the pieces that got destroyed, that was buried in the ground, that was encapsulated and then dug up. Next. Again, drawing remaining at the core of everything that I do. This is a 8-foot-long drawing, pencil drawing, and again, invented, fantastical, otherworldly landscape. Those were the types of people that influenced the work that I did. They were people that were searching for an undefined world. And that's what the basis of these worlds or floating cities or underworld cities are about, is creating something that does not, where I am not reproducing something that already exists, but inventing something, taking the initiative to invent. That detail gives you a better sense as to the pencil drawing itself. These are all pencil drawings. Next. Getting down into the last few, piece on the right is a floating habitat at the Russell Wright Design Center up the Hudson, 30 feet across in diameter, a combination of flat bamboo poles and woven flat reed. It turned out over the course of 4 months to serve as a habitat for returning insects and animals that had abandoned the lake over a period of time. It's a quarry lake. But we discovered that once this structure was built, that animals returned, so that in that sense, not being an environmentalist myself, the sculpture itself was attracting animal life again. The piece on the left from a series of unbuildable structures that was one of the early combinations of basswood, bent basswood, and artificial skin, which I create in the studio, which is essentially acrylic skin. Next, and I believe last, are these 4 examples of stretched skins over the linear infrastructure, which are leading me to the new direction of illumination and these pieces, which I don't have a photograph of, but how do these become something other, not functional sculptures? I don't want to do that. I don't want to walk that strange tightrope between fine art and design. But what I want to do is try to examine the potential of how to take a 3-dimensional structure and create something that is a little bit more immersive or performative. And so this is an example of 4 different figurative components that combine the hand-built infrastructure of bent basswood and the handmade acrylic skin. So there you have it. All of the work informed by either, not either, but architecture, engineering, and product design. And I know there might be some additional questions, but I think it's a great opportunity to introduce someone whose work I feel is, myself, not flattering him, is brilliant, and is also informed, if I might say, by architecture, although he might disagree with me.
Stephen, let me jump in. There's something
Sure.
we always do. That was an amazing performance. There's no question that if we heard you speak for 24 hours straight, we'd all be like better and smarter individuals. That was so rich and so deep. You really took us to a lot of places. I will open it up to any quick questions, and then I'll let you introduce Yuri, okay? So if anybody has any thoughts or comments, I'd say sort of jump right in. I will read. Robin Halpern says, both drawings and sculptures are really creative and beautiful. Elaine Forrest says, most impressive body of work. The pieces are so organic. And she asks, what are you using for the skins? Before you answer that, I will say, Elisa Pritzker says, looking forward to sharing this presentation once it's posted on YouTube. Inspiring art, well presented. And so someone else has said, can you talk a little bit more about the skins, which you don't use that often, obviously, but I guess the materials.
Well, it's not to be the most secretive person in the world, but there are certain things after 30 years in the studio we try to keep to ourselves. But I will tell you, it's simpler than one thinks. It's actually the result of examining a YouTube video on repairing, making repairs in space. And I got the idea from watching the covering of holes in tubes on the space shuttle. And that gave me the idea in part, but also I spent 15 years in Japan. And part of the experience of living in Japan was examining the ways in which lamps or paper was stretched over sticks. But I knew I did not want to use paper. So I combined those two inferences of the more scientific contemporary approach to using a material for repair and then using one for the purposes of illumination. And that combined, and the end-all solution was similar to an acrylic, but a created acrylic, an invented acrylic fiber.
Sandra Indig says, so great, beautiful, and looking forward to the posting that comes up. I do have to ask you, you said at age 6, you made some things, then you had what sounds like a 30 or 40 year gap. What'd you do in the gap years?
I drew. And I think that, drawing was the activity that really took up the bulk of the time, especially in the studio. It was, everything what came out of drawing. Any of the passions that I'm negotiating with now, and I'm still learning and still inventing, they really start with a drawing, because to me, drawing is the most intimate, most direct way of visualizing ideas and taking ideas and making them two-dimensional. And I still find that using the simplest of tools, pencil and paper, is the cleanest, most honest way of expressing and learning and observing and recording. So that there was not 30 years of nothingness, there was 30 years of a commitment to drawing.
Well, yes, Larry, you have a question, and then Babs.
I just wanted to tell you, I love your stuff. I don't know if am I on mute?
No.
We hear
Okay,
you.
good. I love your stuff, and there's certain pieces of your stuff that reminds me of the artist Andy Goldsworthy.
Yeah.
His stuff is also quite extraordinary, very architecturally done in a very nature-driven sense, of course, but quite beautiful. I love your stuff. Have you ever worked with color?
Rarely. I have the only color that I work with is usually the color of the materials that I'm working with. The one grid of objects, which was almost like a salmon color, is the first time I've really attempted to use color. I was raised within monochrome, and because it was 30 years devoted to drawing, to black and white drawing, that really took over the activity. So I really had no interest in color.
Well, can I buy you a box of color pencils?
No, but thank you.
And
Great stuff.
Babs,
Very great.
Babs, go ahead. Babs, you had a question?
Well, it was more a comment and sort of a question. The reason I was asking about the skins is because I started doing this whole series that was titled Skin a long time ago. And I was working with different materials as well to create different types of skins. And I was wondering if you've ever experimented with encaustic or wax, and what I did is I started playing around with the idea of lighting the images as well, because the moment you heat the encaustic into anything that's like a fabric or a paper piece, the wax creates this, it makes it transparent or translucent in a different sort of strange way. And I was stretching it over different things because I was trying to simulate skin. And I didn't want to use real skin. So I was wondering if you'd ever played around with any other materials besides the acrylic. And I just found it fascinating that you were coming to sort of a same place by using acrylics, where I was coming to a similar place, but using encaustic and silk organza and encaustic and rice papers. Yeah,
I have used materials other than acrylic. I have to tell you, though, that the one beauty of being a studio artist, I think, is the notion of inventing. And I think that whatever I use, and I'm using acrylic in this particular case because it was available, but I've used a multitude, but they all come out of the process of inventing. And I think you'll find that is one of the most stimulating parts of being an artist, is to have that opportunity to work in the studio and come up with the unknown solution.
Absolutely. That's what I love doing too. It was interesting to come up with different solutions for something else. Okay, thank you.
And Barry, I'm going to take it over because I've spent enough time bellicosing, and I want to introduce Yuri again, who is an extremely gifted artist, and I'm looking forward to seeing the work that he does. I'm familiar with the work over the past 10 years. He's doing a lot of wonderful new work, and he too, though, I can tell you, is someone is not only attracted to aspects of architecture, but also aspects of drawing. So I think that this is what makes it a very interesting complementary situation of artists. Yuri?
Thank you, Steven. Thank you, everyone, for having us. Before I screen share, I took some time to watch some of the previous presentations, and one of the things that I really like about this group is the way that everyone seems to approach it with a kind of openness and more of an open studio. So I took that as an invitation to make it a little bit more like an open studio instead of just a presentation on my work just so clearly. So I'm going to share some images of my studio, some inspiration images, and then a particular project that's I've been working on for a number of years. So I will share.
I just want to remind everybody, we're ATOA, we're a 501c3. If you'd like to contribute, there's information on our website. And again, thank you both Yuri and Steven for what a brilliant presentation. So go ahead, Yuri, and thank you again.
So I'm going to begin with my idea of the studio. This is an image that some of you might recall. It's from Steven Spielberg's Close Encounters. And in this image, it always just sort of blew my mind, and definitely keeps coming back to me. And without giving too much away in the story, if you haven't seen the movie, the main character is being called and is seeing this form and is being driven to make this form. He sees it in the mashed potatoes, he sees it in the shaving cream, and then he just starts building this form in his house. And then this is a scene where he's talking on the phone, but then he sees the form that he's building on television. This is a scale model from the movie Blade Runner, and it was used as the set for the Tyrell Corporation in the film. And both of these movies were in the 80s, came out in the 80s, and I was young in the 80s. And this notion of making models that were a part of these sort of epic films that created a world was something that influenced me a great deal. This is a video game from the 80s, which is called Super Mario Brothers, although you would have never seen Super Mario Brothers in this form. This is a map of the entire game. So I played this game a lot, and I never saw it in this form, although I intuited that there must be a map to it until I saw a video game magazine in the 80s that had a map of the game that unfolded. And the idea that you were this character that moved through this landscape, that you intuited your way through it, and this whole world that was being created was also something that stuck with me. This is an image of the human body as seen through an MRI machine, which in my lifetime and in our lifetime is something that is still quite new. The idea that we can literally see through the human form and detect anomalies, but it also speaks in a particular language. But this idea that our body there's a kind of transparency to our body is new to our age. And that's something that sticks with me. This is a photograph that I took in the 1990s when I was a student. Photography was something that I studied, but I mostly focused on drawing and sculpture. This photograph was taken in a suburban house that was under construction in New Jersey. And I presume that we are in what would be the living room, and that's the picture window. And since that time, I've thought a great deal about the built environment, the built world that we live in, and then the world beyond, which is the world outside, and how the picture window, or this idea of the suburban home, which I grew up in the suburbs, but then moved to New York and have lived here since 1994, this relationship between the natural world and the interior world of the home, and the perforations between the two, and the idea of the picture have been something that's I've thought a lot about. The invitation today was to talk about how, in some cases, that architecture could inform my work or our work. And the way that I think about architecture, there's architecture that's there to move the soul, right? The highest form, the highest aspirations. And then there's architecture that's there to house the body. And that architects might call building. And in some cases, it's a pejorative. It's to say, if you're a builder versus an architect, there's a distinction there. And I have an interest in what's happening on the fringes of architecture, but as far as my work goes, and as far as what I look at, I look very closely at building, and which to me is a vernacular of the time. It's a language of our time. So growing up in the suburbs, that was a mix of like colonial homes or Victorian homes or split level ranch homes, all of these building methodologies that have a mark of their time, and then the way it all gets scrambled up and built over. This is an image of my studio before the pandemic. I was working on a number of different things. I make drawings, sculptures, sculptural installations. I was beginning to start to make sculptures that took on model making or ideas of model making. And because I had been producing these larger scale sculptural works that required making models, I started to turn to the models as being their own works in and of themselves, and stopped seeing them as models, and started to work in this scaled way. And I'm just going to show you a few examples of what the studio looked like. This is a drawing area, and I make a lot of drawings very quickly that then sometimes accumulate into larger drawings that take a bit more time. But this was a process of drawing that was happening very, very quickly. This was a large project that I was working on before the pandemic, and why I keep saying that might become relevant in a second. So this is my studio during the pandemic, which was my apartment where I'm sitting now. These zones were, my girlfriend and I lived here while everyone quarantined. She ran her business. I made my work in our room that we shared together. So zone 1 was the outside world. Zone 2 was my storage. Zone 3 was my studio. Zone 4 was our television. I feel like there's a missing zone 5. Zone 6 was music. Zone 7 was her office. Zone 9 was also her office. Zone 10 and 11 were the stairs. 12 was miscellaneous storage, and 8 was the realm with which all other areas revolve around. So this idea of compression and compression of space became really important to me. And all of the work I'm going to show now, not all of it, some of it is a little bit before the pandemic, which was you saw in the studio. And then some of it was after the pandemic, made here. And then when I could return to the studio, it was made there. Life in Cities is a title that I'm giving to bracket a kind of work that I'm making. We could call it a project, but the project never had any clear beginning that said, now I'm beginning this project. And it probably doesn't have a clear end. And the title Life in Cities is loose, but at least it kind of puts its puts a bracket around a number of different kinds of work that I'm making. Drawings, sculptures that could turn into larger sculptures, perhaps installations, maybe performances. For now, we're in the sort of small scale sculpture drawing. This is what's been happening the most. First sort of chapter that I'm going to present today is Life in Cities Hyperdevelopment. This sculpture is quite small. It's only about 6 inches across, 4 inches deep, and maybe 8 inches high. And this is very much in the spirit of building, the kind of building that we saw in New York maybe before the pandemic, which was this hyper fast-paced transformation of a city that I mean, we're still experiencing that now, but it took on a different sort of tone and a different sense of feeling before the pandemic, which was just an incredible push forward. And I was curious if I could make sculptures that took on the feeling of the grandness of a city, using found materials, small little objects, pieces of foam, pieces of scraps. How rough could they be while still maintaining the sense of a city? Like how loose could I possibly get while still maintaining it? So some of the things in these sculptures is packing foam, just quickly carved in some way. It's all glued together, painted. And then some things take a bit more time, like some of the buildings there take a bit of time to like actually glue together. So this combination of fast and loose with a little bit more deliberate interests me a great deal. In
Yuri,
some of the, go ahead.
Yuri, let me ask you, are you familiar with Ron Nagel, the ceramicist?
I am.
Yeah, your work is both very different and very similar in some ways.
Yes. Well, thank you. The material properties of these works are they even tighten up a little bit in photograph, like to photograph them this way. They are quite rough, but the materiality of let's say cardboard, like here we have 3-ply cardboard painted gold, and it's just in this scale to me takes on totally different properties. And some of the buildings I've drawn the floors on them. Some of the other things are like little plastic rings I've glued together. Then I built a little room. So like make this, that room in this sculpture is probably maybe 1 inch tall by 1 inch wide, and it's a crunch gym. So this is another sculpture in this sort of group of sculptures where I'm thinking about, much like in the previous sculpture where it's a city, now I'm thinking about some of these corporate spaces. I mean, New York and cities in general have experienced this. Let's put it this way. I'm not going to say anything new or add to the conversation around the way corporations have moved into cities and changed the fabric of that city. There's been a lot of people who have said very interesting things about it. My interest is how, as an artist, I'm observing these changes and making work that in some way presents another reiteration of what's happening in a way that might tell me something about the feeling of that. So this is Bed Bath & Beyond. This is the front and back. This work is called Corporate Pleasure and Corporate Pain. And as a kid, spending a lot of time in New York, I marveled at skyscrapers with a sculpture at their feet. It was odd. It was interesting. It was unusual to me. It struck me. And then all of the things that everything that gets associated with what we think about all of what that represents, in terms of what it means to, even when I learned what air rights were as a young kid, when someone explained to me, even in the case of some of these skyscrapers, that as tall as they needed to go, they needed to create a certain amount of space on the ground for the public. This notion of space and public space and corporate space and sculpture and how all of this stuff was working together was something I wanted to try to tackle in a tiny sculpture. So this sculpture is only about 15 inches tall, maybe by 3 inches wide. This is another one. And for scale, I put a little ruler next to it. Another chapter in this work will be Life in Cities, Tools, Totems, and Traps. So the initial phase of a lot of this work was drawing. Drawing is deeply integrated into my practice. I have trouble making drawings and sculptures at the same time. So I usually alternate between a mode of making sculpture and a mode of making drawing. And if you think back to some of the inspiration images, I was curious about creating an index of a city, at least as I was experiencing it. So what's highlighting to me? And some things are clear what they are, and some things are a little less clear. And that interested me in this intuitive process of what world was being built as I was trying to create it. So here's another example of that. Some of the forms here are just like walls. I was like, let me try to create a whole collection of walls. Let me create a collection of these buildings as they're being built. So they're in that sort of skeletal frame structure at that point. Maybe the walls that enclose an area that's going to be built. So enclosures, buildings, walls, then these platforms start to emerge in the drawings. And I started, I've thought a lot about how New York is really a landscape of rooms, that it's another way of envisioning the city. I struggled a great deal when I moved to New York, in that coming from the suburbs, I struggled with the way space worked, that I could never really see much further than without having something obstruct my vision. And a good friend of mine who grew up in the city recommended to me that I find my favorite rooms. And that became somewhat of an obsession, to start thinking about that the city is all of these rooms stacked on top of one another. And so I was curious if I could just play around with the form of the room, just a simple room that's in the process of being built or coming apart. And then what gets dropped into that room creates a psychological condition in some sense. This is what a group of these drawings looks like installed. This is another drawing with these rooms. I didn't have a better image of it for some reason. I couldn't locate it. But this is 40 ways to work your mind-body connection, is the title of this drawing. And so there are 40 different rooms, and then there's an inventory along the bottom of different objects that could go into those rooms. As a result of making these drawings, I became interested in trying to figure out, could I build these rooms? Could I build some of these forms? And what would that look like? What would that sense like? And I probably I don't think I'm alone in this obsession. I have an obsession with looking at available apartments or real estate in New York, just constantly looking. Even if I'm not thinking about moving, I'm just always looking at what's out there. I don't know why that is. But these 1-bedroom spaces, there's a certain kind of, there's only a limited set of floor plans, let's put it that way. There's a railroad apartment, you have a 1-bedroom apartment. New York, there's a lot of pre-war buildings that might have a galley kitchen. So this was my 1-bedroom apartment. with maybe a little mirrored exercise room. This was another apartment. And I, like in the drawings, there's nothing about the world I'm creating is real. We could talk about it in terms of that it's surreal, but really it's just like symbolic forms placed in conditions where you wouldn't normally have them. So this is, the earth is in one of these 1-bedroom apartments. That's my hand in there for scale. I just wanted to share an image of what it looks like putting these together, because you get a little better, like when they're isolated in those photographs, it's a little hard to see like their scale and size, dimensionality. Also out of those drawings were these sites in the city of construction that have been curious to me. They've always been curious to me. When an area gets walled off and there is a dig happening of some kind, they always take and they cut those little windows in the wall so you can see into what's happening. This the way we're all as pedestrians voyeurs into this construction that's happening. But the other thing that always did, or I found interesting, is it usually carved this space of emptiness in the city. It carved a very unusual space in the landscape or in the cityscape, full of potential or possibility. One of the spaces I find very unusual is there are lots that only have vents coming up from them. And what they're venting is the water line that runs under Manhattan. When they constructed the new water line, there are certain points where they can go down and access it. And so there are like areas where it just looks like an abandoned lot with just a vent coming out of the ground, but it's actually a passageway down to one of the water lines that brings water mains that brings water to the whole city. But these kinds of unusual spaces also seem pretty fruitful to me.
Yuri, I do want to read a few comments. Jenna Lash says, you have an interesting mind, Yuri. So many ideas to ponder. Larry says, thanks to Steven. It was very interesting to speak with you soon. And Lawrence Wheatman says, brilliant inspiration, Yuri.
Thank you.
Very, very nice thoughts from our group.
We have 2 more chapters. So this is Life in Cities Collections, Maps, and Visions. So during the pandemic, when I was sitting in my apartment, I was making these shelf sculptures, these scaled down shelf sculptures. And then thinking about, as I was walking around the city, I was picking up objects and creating these little collections and then making objects to add to the collections. And they were trying to process maybe some of the, I don't really have clear answers to what I was trying to process, except to say that through putting together these collections of objects, there was a reflection back on some of the time, which was feeling very large and expanded. So we have this one. So some of these objects in here are, like I was saying, are found from these like long walks that I was taking. Some are made, like in this sculpture, maybe the like lips on the bottom shelf would have been made. Sculpturally, some of the other things are objects I've been collecting for a long time. I just sort of have these piles of collections of small objects. When we spent so much time indoors in the quarantine, there was this sense of no longer being tied to some of the rhythms that work life and city life would have, like leaving at a certain time to go to work and coming back. So I found myself paying attention to different rhythms, like the natural rhythms of like the cycles of the moon. So I started thinking about like these collections of objects that could perhaps relate to some of that. This is a photo for scale. When I went back to my studio and I started working there again, this was a photograph of the area that I used to make these sculptures. It's a process that I would describe as designing from the pile. You have to make the pile of stuff, and then you can pull and excavate and dig out of this scrap heap to try to curate on these shelves. That was the methods that I was using. This was a sculpture thinking about the sun. Okay, the last chapter in the group is Life in Cities, Vessels, Frames, and Ghosts. These structures, the way that the whole talk began with this notion of being informed by architecture. And I was reframing it a little bit on my own terms to say building, because building is what actually is the thing I most experience, is the thing that actually has the most effect on my experience as a human being living in the city. Building is the thing that actually is what I'm confronted with. And so I was deeply curious in, could I take one of these forms that seems so uninteresting and benign and try to wrestle some sense, some emotion out of it. And it's a little tricky to see in the photographs, but the materiality of the surfaces, the materiality of what's on some of the floors, there are these little objects that are placed on there, and the way you encounter these forms, I hope that some of that came forward. This is a building that's made out of wood and plexiglass and other textured materials, and there is an earth on the 10th floor. And here's a little close-up of like what that earth could look like. This is another structure that all of these, I'm most interested in these buildings when they are halfway being built or maybe being cleared and being started, because it is in those moments that they represent possibility, unknowing, emptiness. They have a kind of curiosity to them, a resonance that when they get all finished and sealed up, they kind of blend into the whole fabric of the overall scene. But when they are in this state of in between, they at least present a question, in my opinion. The final set of works that I have here in this group are these human forms. The pandemic asked us, me, to think a great deal about the body, my fragility, our fragility, all of those things. And then also to spend so much time away from others and start thinking about what it is we're carrying, letting go, like constantly obsessing on our state of being, but as seen through the body in a way that was new to me. And these sculptures, I started thinking about how little much like when I was making the cities, how little do I need to have there to create the human form? How much to add to it, how much to take away for it to still hold? In the design of and fabrication of sculpture, or in architecture even, there's a conversation, and a very simple conversation around, you can make form a couple of ways. You can start with a solid block of something and remove until you reach a form that interests you. You could take a pile of clay that is soft and you can mold something into a form, or you could construct a form. You could take, in that case, maybe in some ways the way Steven does, you could take planar material and construct it into something. So I was interested in here, like the mesh. How can the mesh hold both a flat form and a three-dimensional form? But also, how could I construct the body in a different way? So so much like the model making that went into the rooms, or the model making that went into building some of the cities, could I approach even creating the physical form with some of these ideas of model making? Now, all of these sculptures are very, very small. This is only maybe 10 inches tall. And I was curious if I could do that at such a small scale and still evoke something that's human size, or evoke something that's larger, and how could that interplay happen even when I'm staying at such a small scale? I think that's the end, my images.
That was great, Yuri.
Thank you,
That
everyone.
was great. That was really wonderful.
That really was. Steven, would you like to close up with a few thoughts, and then I'll do my sort of short conclusion?
It gave me a great opportunity to see a broader view of Yuri's work. And so that was one of the positives for sure. But I think that Yuri touched on something that's very important, and perhaps it is a quick to judge mistake on my part when we were talking about titles for this, about being informed by architecture, which we both are. But I think Yuri touched on something very important, which is that there is an integral relationship between drawing and the act of building. And I think that in both of our cases, we are ultimately attracted to the notion of building, less so. Architecture tends to be the broader label on things like this, because it's the assumptive winner when it comes to all of these types of structures. But I too am, if it were not for the act of building, which I equate to the act of drawing, would be less prone to want to even address it. So I think that you've touched on something extremely important for everyone who's made it through this to understand.
Thank you. I want to open it up to some questions before I do sort of a brief conclusion, or just statements. You know how we do it here. I will say Fran Beeler, one of our board member, says in the chat, 2 fascinating, inspiring presentations. And I think, no doubt, we all agree with that. I think I'll refer to this talk as a wake-up call for our brains. Walter Brown says, 2 stimulating talks. Thank you. I appreciate your honesty, Yuri, and your willingness to keep pushing through to the next level. And if anybody else would like to chime in, go ahead, chime in as you like.
Okay, I'm going to chime in. I wanted to ask you how, after you're conceiving these pieces and you're thinking a lot about space, and as you're moving through space, are you thinking about what happens to them then once they're ready to be shown as a body of work, and how you spatially set them up, and how the viewer then comes in and interacts with the pieces? And the reason I'm asking this, because I think a lot about architecture as bodies moving through space. and how you're seeing your pieces, particularly the little sculptural pieces, for example. I mean, obviously drawings are on the wall, but the sculptural pieces, do you have thoughts about how one approaches them when you come into a space?
Is this a question for me? I think so.
I'm sorry, Yuri. Yes, it's a question for you.
I do. I think a great deal about that. And there's a size where someone will project into. That's one of the things that a model does, is that actually it creates a condition where you like if you saw a model of a theatrical set, for example, you would project yourself into it, and it creates a very interesting participatory experience where it's almost like active imagination. And then there's a different size when you walk into a space and you have an encounter with that. And you might have an encounter that one would recognize as having an encounter with a piece of architecture. And those two things are very different. So I've presented the works, you know, depending on the occasion, or, you know, I'm interested sometimes when I can present a lot together in one small group and you can experience and kind of sift through them. But that's a very different experience from having things individually in the space. But it really depends on what that occasion is.
I guess I was thinking about the small pieces and the approach to the small pieces. There, you started with these maquettes, and then you made the maquettes pieces of work, which was very interesting. And then it's a whole different body experience to experience a maquette, obviously, than a piece that you're proposing as a regular life-size space. And that's what I was trying to get at when you now made that switch between one to the other. You know, how did that affect your mind and your approach? I don't know if I'm asking the appropriate question, but I'm just trying to get your thinking about bodies interacting with the tiny versus the large.
I think that one is more mental, is maybe what I'm trying. Like when it's small, you don't have the same kind of body relationship to it. You have a mental relationship to it. You project into it. There's a lot of, you know, in various parts of the world, people build small altars, and the small altar looks like whatever religion you're thinking of, usually looks like whatever the temple is or the church. It's a small one. And when it's small, you don't actually go into it. You envision being in it, or it's a representation of something that holds a kind of psychological space. And that's what became really interesting to me at the smaller scale, is you invite a psychological read that becomes a lot more complex at a much larger scale. The invitation is it's much faster to go there, in my view.
I would like to add a comment, because we are talking about architecture and that implies a space. I mean, to think about how to display, you have to think about where you are displaying. I mean, the space where you are displaying will invite you also to create the way that you will display your work. It's a comment. And I guess that it's difficult to prejudge before you know where you will display the works. That's something that I think it happens when you have a room, one size or another shape also invites you to make your own configuration.
And there's a little bit of a Cornell kind of surrealistic, but just that with these small pieces, which is much more fascinating. It's fascinating to think about that tiny scale and those little worlds that you are creating. And when we're seeing them in your studio, it was hard to see them as these separate little items. And it was actually quite lovely to see the individual ones shot, you know, the images of the individual pieces. But then you're going to come into a room now and you're going to see all these little worlds. It's just interesting to switch scale.
Very nicely done. Yuri, sorry to cut you off. Go ahead.
No, those are all interesting comments, and I think that there are things to continually think about, especially when small scale sculpture is always tricky. And there's a number of great sculptors who have solved those issues a number of different ways, about how the work lives in various places, or how it can carry, like if you think of the Cornell box pieces, how the frame in that instance declares its own space, and then you look inside the frame that separates it from everything around it. The images that I had in my studio was really the way that I make them. It was not necessarily, I've experimented with displaying them that way, but it is a very curious and exciting, in my view, prospect to always be thinking about what are the ways of the encounter with a work, especially with a small work.
Well, I don't know. At some point, I imagine like a huge glass vitrine with different shelves and all the worlds, like also a building inside a building. I don't know. It was just kind of putting all your small in different, shelves in a big glass. So it was something that it occurred to me.
Thank you.
Almost
Was
like
very-
looking in a building, and seeing all the little
Exactly.
rooms.
I was
Yeah.
building a building with your small buildings.
Yeah.
Very
Well-
exciting work. Very interesting.
I don't know if
It's
you
obvious. Go ahead, Steven.
I was going to say, I don't know whether you think about this, Yuri, but I was thinking about it as I was looking at the work, the relationship of the model to the theoretical largeness of a building, consistent with the relationship of a drawing and then a painting of that drawing, where there's something sucked out, the intimacy of the model and the sort of confessional nature of a drawing is somehow much more poetic than when the model is made large and the drawing is turned into the painting. It's not to discredit either process or either ending. But I think one of the things that is quite remarkable about the model, and especially you show it in the work that you do, is that there's no reason necessarily to want to see it large. And in the same way, there are often times when you go into a traditional gallery and you'll see the drawings for a painting, and you'll see that there's so much tremendous life that is a part of the drawings that somehow gets colored in by the paint. So that there's a very similar response, at least from the perspective that I had.
Thank you. Yeah, those concerns are always very tricky. How one thing has a life in its roughness and its quickness and its speed and its immediacy, and then what happens when you try to scale up or you approach that, maybe even that same thing at a much larger size.
Plus, I'm jealous because your work is smaller in scale. So.
Well,
Steven, I have one quick question for you. Do the dancers and the people that are interacting with your work, are they physically on it, in it, or are they dancing in and around it?
In most cases, because of engineering and liability, they are in it or around it, but not on it.
Okay, that's what I thought. But I just
And the other, to answer your question, many times a choreographer is commissioned to create a piece for a sculpture, as opposed to something that exists. And I think that that's a little bit more organic than just saying, go out there and do the Watusi next to the piece.
yeah, I know I've had the experience myself where, because I don't know why, but they always decide they want to like have some choreography with my installations. And it's interesting, but I have much more, it's organic, it's fluid, and these silk organzas flowing. And so there's this interaction that they can have. But I was just thinking of your pieces, which are wonderful, but I just thought, well, how do you deal with the liability of that?
Yeah, well, generally engineers are hired for things like that, but I will tell you that more times than not, I'm not overwhelmed with how a choreographer interprets the work. So that's the other component that I have to contend with.
Well, nicely done, both of you. I'll read one more comment. Fran Beeler says, thanks so much. Barbara Sherman, what a great program. Two such original thinkers. There's no way I can summarize what went on in this talk. There was so much food for thought, but I think there is one big takeaway, and you picked up on it, Steven. You're both builders, and even more than that, you're both creators. And I think the reference to sci-fi, you're creating other worlds, and artists do that. I mean, we don't just mimic, we're not just inspired, we sort of translate and go beyond. And I think that's a goal of surrealism that was mentioned, and a goal about all of us as artists. You remember, there's a big question, was God a woman or was God a man? We know one thing, he was an artist, he was an artist. God is a creator. And that's a way for me to sort of bring in biblical mythology. And I think you're prime examples of creators, original creators, and hence your reluctance, Steven, to use the word inspiration, because you're really, you're drawing a new river for us. This was brilliant. I will also say, we've done about, I think it's 79 or 78 talks so far, and 79. We haven't done one talk titled COVID and how it affects artists. However, every talk we've done has cataloged artists' response to COVID. There is no way not to express that. And Yuri, you certainly, with your images of your studio before COVID, and then that, if you don't mind me saying, that clusterfuck of an apartment with the zones laid out. I mean, that was a brilliant juxtaposition. And Steven, also you showing how you went to drawing, even though you totally emphasize drawing is your backbone of everything. So COVID's impact, it's hard for us as artists to be in the moment and know exactly what we're doing and talking about. A lot of work takes 2 or 3 years to understand. If you really need to understand, we need to make it. And I think part of these talks have been that we are very much fleshing out how COVID has impacted artists. And these are cataloged on YouTube, on our channel. And I think that's part of the real value beyond what you guys presented on architecture, which was totally brilliant. It was obvious for the comments. You've sort of, as we always do, artists are inspiring artists here. I see Wendy List, a sculptor, thinking like, there's an idea. And that's what it's about. I appreciate you, Steven, holding back on some of your materials. But bottom line is, we put it out there for free for others to see and engage. I can't help but mention, when I saw Jeff Koons' exhibit, the drawings, and this is a few years back, maybe the last show at the old Whitney, the drawings held more power for me than the finished works. To me, Christo's drawings of his projects hold more power than the covered buildings. There is that sort of power in a drawing that you lose certain tension when you scale up or when you make a painting from it. You guys hit on a lot of great talks. I can't thank you enough. Everybody, keep in mind, next Monday is an open talk. Anyone can present. Go to our website if you'd like to contribute. All our talks are free. I got to thank you, Steven, for organizing this. What a brilliant conversation.
In an act of flagrant self-promotion, I will tell you, if you go to my website, there is a recently released 40-minute documentary on how I survived the coronavirus. So it's done by a wonderful West Coast production company.
And that his website, as well as Yuri's, is listed on our website, so you can access it by one click. Thank you all for coming, for sharing your thoughts, asking your questions, and as always, being part of our hive. The hive mind does more than the individual. It's sort of a gestalt. There's a gross cumulative effect you can't get from adding a piece and a piece. And I think, Steven, in your work, you talk about having pieces that you put together and they morph and you grow something more than the individual parts. Maybe that's what's at the heart of creation. Thank you all so much.
Thank
Thank
you,
you, Barry. Thank you, Barry.
Thank
You're
you so
welcome.
much.
Thank you, Barry. Bye.
Thanks, Barry. Good evening.
Thank you to the artists. Bye.
Good night.
Thank you. It was wonderful.
Thanks, Wendy.
Not just visually exciting, but these guys know how to talk about art. Let's just say that.
Oh my God, that was a lesson right there.
I am serious. They're very good communicators, as you are, Barry. All right,
Thanks.
have a good night. It was
You
great.
too.
I loved it. Loved it.
That was a good one.
It was. That was a good one.
They all are. But that hit some heights. Thanks, guys. Nice to see you, Lawrence, Michael, everybody. Thanks for coming.